Welcome back to the county seat. We have been discussing the topic of prisoners in county jails and health insurance. And so far we've gotten off to a fairly lively discussion. You know, the insurance industry says that that there's greater cost and it adds risk, and so therefore everybody's rates would go up on the insurance because they're already calculating for an exemption. But you point out that the risk off the street is actually not as much as is on the street when they're in jail?
There's no question that you're going to be safer incarcerated. You're there 24/7 with correctional officers who are watching you and making sure that you're safe inside. You know, your exposure to risk out on the street is many times greater than it would be behind bars. So we would suggest that those insurance companies that are that actually people are paying premiums to get that insurance, they're better off in jail when it comes to the risks.
And you have a smile on your face.
Well, there aren't a lot of car accidents when you're incarcerated. You know, there aren't a lot of slip and falls. There aren't a lot of all of these things that insurance companies do factor in on their actuarials. I mean, what the sheriff says is exactly correct. You can't find a safer place on earth from a injury accident perspective than the corrections. I mean, the argument they would make that they're going to be assaulted or some other incident inside the facility, the statistical reality of that is almost non-existent. Jails are an extremely safe place these days, and although it does happen, it's very infrequent, and it certainly wouldn't affect the.
Chad, I don't know how their costs would go up when they've already been collecting a premium to pay for the costs. That's the reason why we're bringing the legislation. If you're not being paid for it, and the taxpayer needs to pick up the cost, that's one thing. But if you're an insurance company and you're already being paid to cover the cost, and then you're not covering the cost, we think that's where the taxpayer is being hurt and having to pick up a cost they shouldn't have to pay for.
How does public assistance? I mean, if you have people that aren't, you know, with health insurance and they're on Medicaid or Medicare, you know, how do those agencies react to this?
Well, they take the same position, I think, at least in the past, that the insurance companies have, and that is if you have an indigent person that winds up in jail, then they suspend their Medicaid payments. We think that's equally unacceptable. They should be covering those individuals. If they weren't in jail, they'd be covering those individuals. And I think this may be where the commissioner could speak up a little bit. We don't think it's fair that a local property taxpayer should pay those costs when they probably, in a lot of cases, aren't even a county resident to begin with.
Well, John, how do you feel about that?
Well, I agree. One of the things that we do all the time as commissioners, and I'm sure it's true in every county, is they do everything they can to keep our expenses of operating the county to a minimum. I know our sheriffs do. We have a great sheriff in Davis County that's doing that very thing. But when they get these types of charges, and of course the medical charges can be so expensive, then at some point in time there's going to be a need to either get some other reimbursement, or we're going to have to raise taxes to deal with that. And I know that that's the very last thing we want to do. So there's probably a lot of these people who won't have insurance and won't qualify for insurance, but those who do ought to be paying. I really believe they should be paying their share.
If I could add, though, I think this year our argument has been strengthened rather significantly because Medicare will pay for medical costs of incarcerated individuals. We've identified several states that have been submitting for Medicaid reimbursement, and we in Salt Lake County have started as well. The reason I say that's important in so many ways, we estimate that about 70% of our out-of-facility medical expenses might be covered under Medicaid, which is a huge amount, give or take, you know, $3.5 million at a minimum. But the value of that is if we can go back to these private insurers and say, wait a minute, the federal government's now picking up the expense for Medicaid. Why is it that your exemption holds true now? Because actuarially speaking and all these other arguments seem to evaporate once we've done that. So, and that's a good, the Medicaid payment issue, and a lot of people will be upset. They'll think, well, doggone it, they're going to hit us in another way. Well, it actually will save money by being able to use Medicaid. People lose their coverage when they are in jail, and it takes anywhere from 6, 12, 18, 20 weeks, sometimes never, Do they get back reinstituted on the Medicaid rolls? And for seriously, persistently mentally ill, this means they don't have an ability to get very expensive psychotropics. Now, with them being covered on Medicaid, when they walk out our door, they've been covered the entire time. They walk out on the street, they can walk down to a clinic and continue to receive that vital care. That saves the emergency rooms, public safety workers, everybody, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of
It
dollars.
saves the counties as well.
It does.
There is a difference as well in prisoners incarcerated through state corrections and people remanded to the county jail. And once somebody becomes, and let me ask that question, because I don't think this argument is saying if you are sentenced with a felony and you're going to spend prison time, even if it's contracted out to a county, that's a different issue.
It is.
That's not a question here, because then the state is obligated to take up that health care cost. Is that not correct?
Mm-hmm. That is correct. That is correct. It's a completely separate issue. The folks in jail...
Well, not according to the insurance industry, because they're lumping it all together.
Right. Well, yeah, that's exactly right. But there are significant differences in folks that go to prison. They're there for an extended period of time, usually years. The folks that we're seeing in our jails, the national average is only about 2 to 3 weeks is what they're staying in a correctional institution at the county level. So we see a major difference in those types of folks.
Where do you go from here? I mean, you put in a bill last year. What do constituents need to do to try and, persuade the legislature to look differently? Because it apparently is at a point, obviously, you've had to look at all kinds of things in Salt Lake County just to try and make budget. It's having an impact which goes on to the taxpayers in some form or another.
It's every county. It's not just Salt Lake County. As the commissioner indicated, I mean, if you look at a percentage of budget of many of the jails, your medical expenses are going to be huge, especially burdensome on a rural county who might have a $3 or $4 million total jail budget. Now you have an individual that comes in with a high-risk pregnancy or any number of other ailments. I mean, you're talking $100,000 and $150,000 per case a medical expense when a total budget is $3 million. This can break the bank. So these medical expenses is something we're going to have to address. And again, the most appropriate mechanism is a shared burden. The state is already doing their share. The condition of probation inmates we have, or those sentenced, the state's picking them up. The counties right now are picking it up at 100% for unsentenced. That's not right. We've got to be in this together and figure out how we mitigate those expenses. And I think that's what we need, is a rational conversation about what the burden should be. Nobody's asking anybody to bear anything alone.
Particularly, we're not asking them to bear a burden they haven't been paid for. That's the key. They're collecting a premium to cover those individuals. They should bear that responsibility to provide that coverage, even though they're in jail for a couple of weeks, or they're even just on a pre-trial, as we indicate, and haven't been convicted of anything. That certainly ought to be a responsibility for the insurance carriers, since they're collecting premiums on those individuals.
Well, what do people do? I mean, this could be legislatively corrected. Is that not?
It'll have to be legislatively corrected.
All right. So is UAC planning to put a bill in?
We are. We did last year, as I think your story indicated to begin with, and we'll file something similar. We'll look at it and see what issues might arise in the actual language of the bill. That we would use something very close to what we filed last year.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, we'll be back with more of the county seat in just a minute. We'll wrap this up and we'll find out a little bit of good jail news as we wrap up our episode this week. Stay with us.